I think the real problem was people weren't understanding the deals that they were making probably on both sides. And I think that's a challenge for some of those who are offering these agreements, is whether they actually know what it is they're drafting and what its implications are for the people they're talking with.
Hello and welcome to Scotland Matters. This is part 2 of our episode on Insetting. I'm Eleanor, the Senior Policy Advisor, and I'm joined by Laura Ferrier, our Policy Advisor on Natural Capital, and Jeremy Moody from the CAAV. So in the first part of the podcast, we explored what insetting is and some of the opportunities it may bring. But we also discussed a number of important questions facing farmers and land managers. Questions around fair payment, contract length, ownership of data, future management flexibility, and other sort of long-term considerations for insetting. Those concerns are exactly what led a number of farming and land management organisations to come together with SLE and the CAAV to share an open letter to both the supply chain and governments across the UK, and that's why Jeremy has joined us today. So we'll start with what our motivation was. So why farmers are concerned about insetting. So we had a number of members raise issues, but Laura, can you give us a bit more information on the sort of issues that members had been raising with us? And Jeremy, I'm sure you'll have heard of similar stories yourself.
Yes, so I guess the key thing was understanding whether the agreements that they were being presented with were fair and what the long-term implications of those agreements were going to be. So these were new agreements that were coming through, and understanding actually what are those impacts going to be, and am I being asked to do appropriate things? Am I being compensated fairly? And all of those issues that we were talking about in the last podcast. So thinking about who owns the data, what data do I need to collect, and how will I need to record it?
And Jeremy?
Yeah, I think the issues here are they build as people begin to think about what they're confronted with. And one of the challenges is that I think people are not necessarily used to thinking about environmental and natural capital issues as simple business issues that they are for them to take a pragmatic and practical choice on as to whether they are good decisions or bad decisions, whether they bring benefit or they just bring liability. And as you get into this, so a core question is around loss of control over the farm, and allied to that is loss of control over some of the environmental assets that you may wind up with obligations to ensure, for example, carbon or other benefits purely for somebody else. Now, you may be happy to do that. It's less likely that many commercial farmers might wish to, but there are many other types of people who own rural land. But that gets to the question of whether they're actually being paid fairly for it, for the length of the agreement that might be required, for the commitment that they might have to manage this for somebody else, and the risks of liabilities down the line. Let us just say that if there's a requirement to plant some trees, what happens if those trees die? Is there any further payment for replacing them? Probably not. And then how that fetters control for the future over a potential development prospect on the farm, or indeed the business that the next generation might want to run.
So issues such as sort of succession, taxation, borrowing and insurance have been probably issues that we've, as sort of advisors and stakeholders, sort of quietly been raising in discussions that we're party to. But are they something that farmers have perhaps been unaware of or sort of somewhat ignoring when they've been presented with these opportunities?
I think it's that they haven't come to the front of farmers' minds, and partly it is, I think, where things come forward under a green label, they sit in a different box in how people think about them. And it is that task of having people exercise pragmatic judgment. If they came to sell an animal in the market, they want a good price for it. If they're coming to sell this in the market, are they going to get a good price for it? And that mindset, I think, is really quite important. I was on the HMRC working party on looking at the taxation of these areas, and a premise for that was that deals were not being done because people didn't understand how they're going to be taxed. But underneath it all, I think the real problem was people weren't understanding the deals that they were making probably on both sides. And I think that's a challenge for some of those who are offering these agreements, is whether they actually know what it is they're drafting and what its implications are for the people they're talking with. And having a good and mutually intelligent insight on both sides into what's on the deal may actually make for better deals for both parties, rather than the deal that one looks at interestedly to start with and then realizes against their interests, and the other then regrets that they offered it that way. There can be better ways to do this business. And I could think that when we're looking at the Scope 3 emissions, I think you discussed in the previous broadcast, that a purchaser doesn't have to control it. A purchaser simply has to have assurances. And that matters enormously when you think, for example, about a supermarket, when 99% of the emissions it's associated with are outside its control, running through the supply chain. And they cannot possibly want to control all those, but they can want assurances.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point to make there, that can sometimes be a bit of a misconception when thinking about what insetting agreements are. An insetting agreement isn't about selling an outcome to a buyer necessarily. Those outcomes should remain with the supplier. It's just that the buyer can then claim them and use them because the carbon footprint of their supplier has been reduced. It's not about transferring ownership, and it doesn't need to be. That's more what offset agreements are for.
And is that perhaps lack of full understanding between sort of both sides? Is that often result in, or I think we've sort of perhaps seen it resulting in mixed messages or confusing messages when things are communicated to a farmer as to what they're signing up to, which certainly muddies the waters in terms of good faith and in signing up.
No, I think that's a real challenge, the question of good faith. And I do think there's an issue that people offering deals that they don't themselves understand, and they don't need the deal to be as they've offered it to get what they want. And so, just as with any other, a mutual insight to mutual benefit, creating value for both is a good idea. Grabbing value ignorantly is probably the worst idea. And that's, I think, where we are right at the bottom end of the learning curve on these kinds of deals. And that's, in fairness, and I think that's true for both sides. I can think of a conversation a couple of years ago where I had to explain that for a carbon arrangement, nobody was selling atoms of carbon. The atoms of carbon in the tree didn't change ownership. What the landowner was doing was taking on a liability to ensure that there would be that volume of carbon on the farm. Once you express it that way, in the practical way the deal has to work, then you can start working through the analysis, arriving at what's a sensible deal, understanding liabilities, discovering whether or not it makes sense, whether you're being offered enough money, whether there are other ways of doing it.
But I think also we've got to acknowledge that on the buyer side, the buyers are also early on in their journeys. These might be organisations that have only just started accounting for their greenhouse gas emissions, and they might be kind of in their first phase of looking into their Scope 3 emissions. So there's kind of, as Jeremy said, there's learning to be done there. And equally, these could be large entities, and there may be multiple departments involved in the generation of these agreements. You might have sustainability teams going, well, okay, these are the actions we think that need to be done to reduce emissions. You then might have marketing and comms teams saying, okay, well, this is how we want to talk to our suppliers, and this is how we want to present these outcomes publicly. You then will have kind of finance and operation teams looking at it from the bottom line. So there are lots of different departments and probably lots of different conversations happening internally as well, that then all have a part to play in developing these agreements. And it could mean that these agreements are really collaborative, but it could mean that these agreements also kind of end up in a form that is not the intention of any one of those kind of departments individually, and it comes as a bit of a hodgepodge and may not have the outcome that is intended. So I think that's also something that we've got to be really careful of as well.
Yeah, and the one person tasked with discussing this to the farmers, who will have to then change their activities or respond to what's being asked of them, is perhaps also not getting the full picture from all the various parties potentially ends up in a sort of, I've just got to say what needs to be said to get this over the line because the pressure is to get them joined up to it, and we'll deal with the comms bit later. Very similarly to when we get agricultural policy changes framed from a, how do we explain this to the electorate, and not how do we explain that this is a logical, sensible change for the farming business, because we've forgotten that the audience needs a different message, even though the change is the same.
And it's also quite difficult then for the person dealing with the farmer to go back into the bowels of the firm they're representing and explain that this doesn't actually make that much sense on the ground. There are other ways of doing this that would be more so. And all those internal silos in that firm can struggle to react to it.
And what we'll perhaps get is those actors in the supply chain sort of coming to us and saying, they just don't understand it. And you go, no, I'm just not quite sure you're explaining it, but maybe none of us seem to understand it well enough, and we're sort of barreling on ahead. But some of the misconceptions are kind of well known, and we perhaps just ignore them, which isn't helpful. But one of the big sort of challenges we do come across, which is an entirely known quantity, and that is tenants and tenancy requirements, and the difference between Scotland and England and other parts of the UK. But there will be many supply chain agreements going to tenants, perhaps without either side understanding that they have specific obligations. How do we sort of address that?
It is a practical difficulty, because a tenant holds the land against the landlord, both sides of the border. That is the point of it being a tenancy. It is held. The tenant has control, but only within the terms of the tenancy and for the life of the tenancy. And some of these agreements can be very long-term. Some of these agreements, quite typically, can bear on things like re-wetting land or trees or something else that either alters the nature of the tenancy or is outside the tenant's legal powers. And if this makes sense, then it's something for the landlord and tenant to talk about and try and arrive at a practical answer to dealing with it. It's not for the tenant to alter the nature of the landlord's property, but the landlord should be looking for the tenant to have a proper business interest. Equally, of course, in this, the reason why many people are tenants is precisely because they want to get on with the commercial business of farming. That's what they do, that's who they are. And these kinds of agreements, which may be more attractive to the larger, perhaps more rounded interest of a landowner, may actually simply not feel very relevant if you are an active commercially farming tenant looking to earn the money that buys your breakfast and pays your rent.
So, having heard all these sort of concerns and seen sort of evidence of things that we thought were not quite, perhaps not quite what we were expecting to see. So what was it that kind of prompted the sort of the writing of these letters to both the supply chain and the government? What was it that we felt we needed to sort of achieve from taking this into the open rather than hushed conversations?
So I think primarily it was because we were seeing this growing trend in Insetting. The number of agreements that were coming through meant that it was a growing concern for our members, and then it's something that we need to look into. There was concern amongst our members that these were agreements that they were being asked to sign, but there was a lack of clarity as to what Insetting even meant. In a kind of larger context, a wider context, we're seeing a growing pressure to decarbonise in agriculture for supply chains and for land managers themselves. And we want to make sure that this is a good system and it's designed as a good system from the outset to ensure a just transition, rather than it being something that we have to go back and fix in the future, or something that, a farmer sees a poor agreement now, they're kind of dissuaded from getting involved, and then an agreement comes down the line in future that is better for them, but they've been put off and they don't want to get involved. So we just want to get it right, and we do feel that there are actions that supply chains can be taking now, and we feel that there is leadership that government can be taking and things that they should be doing more of to ensure that we're creating a good environment in these spaces.
Yeah, very much that sense of being at the bottom end of the learning curve on both sides. And so to get behaviour right at the beginning, while we're all still actually trying to understand values for some of these things, and in the context of what are, even for some Scottish land ownerships, actually quite small penny lots in some of these environmental deals. with all the probable obligations for the future of monitoring, of reporting, of verification, the continuing liabilities down the coming years, actually understanding that what we've got is something that is durable, that is a sensible venture for a farmer to enter into, and that it is a practical way to achieve the objectives of the would-be buyer. And let's get this, as Laura was saying, let's get this right at the beginning, rather than have to unscramble an omelette later on, which is a very much harder task.
Would you say that the government's been very, very open in its want of private finance to deliver a lot of these things, but has it perhaps been too slow to actually set parameters as to what that behaviour should look like, how we should get there? And so the sector's sort of been left to kind of deliver it in a way that most suits them, rather than that need for an equal, fair approach.
I think it really is that governments north and south of the border have had a touching naivety in the likely availability of private finance. The Green Finance Institute did a report some 3 or 4 years ago, which said that to meet this decade's ambitions, both the Scottish government and in England would need 20 billions of private finance. Well, DEFRA's aspiration is to find 1 billion by 2030. And while there are investors out there for very large companies for whom the sums of money we're talking about might actually just be within their advertising budget rather than anything else, these are vastly larger than are relevant to the kinds of supplies going on farms. So there's a major mismatch between the supply and demand sides of the market. There's also a mismatch between a lot of private finance, which wants quite a short-term exit, say a 5-year horizon, to come in, do a project, achieve value, sell on. And the point about environmental improvement is it's a long-term patient game. And so I think that those challenges of mismatch of scale for the people who come forward to government and say, oh, we're very keen, when they can go off and do 600,000 acres of the Peruvian rainforest instead, and the mismatch of timescale. And it's almost that we're talking to exactly the wrong people for many of these things. And that then is a problem for the suppliers who are actually talking directly with farmers, because they're then almost caught in the middle between these exercises as their lenders and investors. And the lenders and investors to the supermarkets and the really big processing companies are all wanting clean books on this score. And somehow we come down to a 300-acre farmer somewhere in Lothian, trying to see if any of this makes sense.
Yeah, there's a great way to sort of move on to the sort of next kind of topic is when we've having written the letters, having set out what we expect the supply chain to be sort of doing, or what they ought to be considering, and asking the government and telling the government what it needs to act on farm. What does good insetting look like? I
think if I'm talking to a commercial farmer, I mean, where the motives are more straightforward, and recognising that many landowners have broader concepts of stewardship and wider concerns and other land than just the farmland and so on, my advice to a commercial farmer is to particularly know your carbon, but be aware of the other environmental issues, to know your baseline and audit it, and effectively to hoard it. And not necessarily put it on the balance sheet, but have it so that you know it's there, it's yours. You can then look at suppliers and say, look, I'm getting better at this. Here is my half of the handshake, but I'm not handing it over. And look for an adult relationship between the two parties on exactly this. Hiding your head in the sand, ignoring the whole issue, is as bad as doing cheap, unworthy deals that don't give a reward for the commitments they may enter into. This is knowledge, it's assurance, it's competent management.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think from the supplier perspective, good insetting looks like you've got free, prior and informed consent for engaging in these agreements. You're being compensated for entering into these agreements, and that you continue, as Jeremy said, to own the outcomes and the data. We don't necessarily know, for example, what compensation should for sure look like, but these are things that I would be looking at. And I think for me, the key thing is that there is best practice out there, but there seems to be this attitude that best practice is for when you go abroad and you invest in an offsetting project in the Amazon, and we really need to be thinking about indigenous communities there and the wildlife there, and that's when we need to be delivering best practice. But we also need to be delivering best practice at home when we're looking into these agreements. I think there's also good insetting from a buyer perspective. There are things that buyers need to be thinking about. It's permanence of outcomes. It's whether you're insuring against double counting. You need to be thinking about whether it works in a devolved nation policy context. We need to be thinking, for buyers, it can be about data comparability as well. If you're collecting data across various suppliers, does all of that data integrate and work well together? And it's about working with suppliers and bringing them along, not requesting more than what can be delivered in terms of capacity and capability. The buyer does have to consider things like spatial boundaries, inventory boundaries, and allocation. So it is a complicated picture. So for suppliers and buyers, there are considerations that need to be taken there.
I think the next point then, looking down the corridor of the years, is to have a relationship that's strong enough to allow for adaptive management. We are looking at increasingly extreme weathers changing what can be farmed, making new opportunities in places, but challenging old ecologies. It's always a good question, what is the viable ecology for 2050? Rather than asking what was the viable ecology of 1950 when we look at all of this. We are learning more, science is developing. Practical management, we're learning more about doing these things. And 5, 10, 15 years' time, we may actually find that the circumstances that we're trying to do this in have changed, or that we now know we could achieve a similar result by a different route. And we can write an agreement for now. Trying to draft that sort of flexibility is challenging and ultimately turns on there being a good relationship over the years between the two parties. And building that will be worth almost any amount of legality.
Yeah, and those relationships are so important. And as we kind of gathered evidence from members and further afield, the contracts that we were looking at and the terms of reference and other sort of starter documents for these agreements were showing some quite concerning absences of things you would expect in a contract. Now, the agriculture supply chain adjudicator actually only works for dairy and pork, so there perhaps just isn't a knowledge of what a good contract should be. But the fear is farmers are not seeking advice on things they're signing, possibly because, well, they grow it or they produce it and it needs to sell, and this is the market they've always used, and this is a new add-on, but let's just not question it because it's sort of green and different and it's not the commodity. So what should contracts include in this sort of area, and how, what should be the thing that makes you get independent professional advice?
I suspect the first answer to your last question is it perhaps should be culturally incumbent on the person proposing it to recommend that the independent advice is taken. Yeah. That would be true in the financial world or elsewhere. It would be true between landlord and tenant, typically, that you should say, I'm offering you a deal, but go take your own advice. This is not on my back that you're doing it. And that would be, I think, just good practice for that. For drafting agreements, I think the fundamental point is always to understand what the underlying business deal is. Then you can get to looking at how you shape it, what's the right vehicle for the agreement. Sometimes it's even granting a tenancy to the person who's going to do the management. It may be some rights of land, it may be a personal contract. Those are all different ways of doing things. But if you don't have a shared understanding of what the underlying business deal is, then it's all going to come unstuck somewhere down the line because somebody won't have a shared understanding of what's going on. All agreements should include a dispute resolution clause. Even when people are absolutely in agreement at the time, something comes out of the woodwork afterwards that needs some kind of independent resolution. So I think that those are core parts. Provisions for payment. Are funds going to be held in trust to be released as targets are met? How is that to work? But even more than that, getting the right quantum for funds to meet the obligations and see a reward for the person undertaking them, which gets you back to the business deal.
Would you say that sort of transparency in those aspects of the agreement should be very obvious very soon in the conversation, and they shouldn't be left as a sort of an assumption when you finally get the contract that you've talked around for so long with your sort of relations manager with that supplier?
It's got to be better that way.
Yeah.
I mean, there is obviously a large culture, rural informality in many of these things, and people do rely on a handshake and often a shared misunderstanding between them of what they're about. But on something like this, where you are significantly affecting a business, its ability to trade, or its ability to use its land, then there is a duty, particularly, I suspect, on if there's a much larger party to the contract, for them to try and be as clear and as transparent as possible to ensure that the other party gets independent advice, not relying on what they're saying, simply as part of achieving a climate of good faith.
I think we can also look at this in the wider context of kind of carbon markets and carbon reporting and accounting. And transparency is a key element of this. And we have seen in the past, potentially in carbon markets, there being real issues where these systems aren't transparent and actually, we're generating fewer credits than were projected, or these are of lower integrity, we're not achieving those outcomes. So actually, even outside of kind of the business context, in a wider kind of natural capital carbon context, transparency is key, and we can't proceed without transparency, and transparency is a key requirement of building and reporting on greenhouse gas inventories. So it's a kind of minimum that we need as well.
Yeah, I mean, so many of these markets are, to a large extent, not markets in real things. They're markets in what regulations have created and expectations have created. And we've been there before with milk quotas, which were terribly simple, but ultimately a function of regulation, and disappeared when regulation went. England saw an upset to the nutrient neutrality market when the government thought of a different way of doing it, and that sent a shudder through those markets. So they can be quite precarious. Fundamentally, they depend, like any market, on how do you show title, who owns what, and how do you measure it. So for milk quota, it was the volume and the butterfat. That was simple. It was recorded, and there you were. For some of these things, it's much more nebulous. Trying actually to measure soil organic carbon within 10% of any previous measurement is just luck. So there are elements of trust and how you really think these things are achieved as part of looking at it.
How much do you think the sort of attitude to insetting and emission and sort of scope 3 reductions has been impacted by the sort of green attempt of the red tractor scheme, and the sort of uproar when that was the attempts to bring in that green chapter? It led to the huge review of the whole sort of compliance market and audit sort of bodies. Do you think that sort of set the hairs racing a bit in agriculture in terms of attitude to these sorts of green schemes?
I think this has been a story running that's been I think this is a story that's been running longer than that. So that was almost a reaction that then blew up in the face of the people who were doing it to earlier things. I think we've had sort of successive waves. The enormous fashionable focus on ESG, environmental social governance, that came through, that is subtly changing its meaning in some ways these days, perhaps to energy growth and security. But that's possibly a more subtle observation. But what you have, and some of this is washing across from the Atlantic in overall attitudes to this, but what you have, though, are key major players becoming increasingly anxious about the sustainability and security of their supply chains. will there be the barley for Scottish whisky? If I'd put the question sort of one way or one way of looking at it, but you could just put that so much more widely between the volatility of climate change, precariousness of international supply chains with interesting geopolitics about the place. All these things are leading some of the really big players, including central banks and the rest, to be really quite interested and think harder about how do I have a business that looks like the one I know in 5 years' time. And that sends ripples down the chain that ultimately turn up as things looking like this. And I suspect that's a large part of the driver. And the green side of the red tractor debate was an attempt at a reaction to all of that, and that then blew up.
I suppose the question, this kind of early on in the sort of rollout of insetting agreements and the sort of adding on to commodity contracts with these requirements is, can a contract ever be voluntary if a farmer feels that they're going to lose a key market outlet by even questioning the proposal?
And that's a real challenge in a whole number of markets or agreements where one player has a dominant position, if effectively there are only one or two key buyers. I mean, in a sense, that's a variation of the position farmers and the supermarkets on produce.
Yeah.
Ultimately, levels of supply and demand adjust. What are the farmers' alternatives? In this, building adult confidence sometimes for farmers in this, to think that they might have options or alternatives, or just be respected more if they stood their ground. All these are possible things, but the picture you paint is one that would be recognised in a number of other areas where people do feel that they are between a rock and a hard place. And you look at when costs rise suddenly in a sector like apples, and the costs are simply not picked up by the buyer. Not the first year, maybe the second year, because of the difficulties in transmitting economic pressure in those circumstances. But that's why there is this increasing pattern of adjudicators and so on around is one regulatory answer to it, whether effective or not. It's ultimately, we do see then sometimes supermarkets sense that they need to act to protect their own supply chains, and that then modifies their behaviour. But some of these large buyers can be more stubborn for longer than a farm business can survive.
Does the sort of cooperative model potentially have an option here, or are some of these commodities so big that the supply and demand argument doesn't quite work? You couldn't, as a cooperative, get big enough power.
It's going to be case by case, I think, when looking at that one. There's a very interesting model south of the border with British Sugar, where British Sugar invests as part of AB Foods in very expensive factories that need a guaranteed supply chain to make them sensible. And you have the annual standoff between both sides as to what is the price they have to pay in order to get enough farmers to produce what's necessary to keep the factory going. And and they can only sensibly come from the area where the factory is. Recently, farmers have tended to feel they're not being offered quite the price they need on that one, but at other times British Sugar has had to give. So at that level, when you're looking at more diffuse global commodity markets, then that leverage doesn't happen the same way. You're just up against global commodity markets. In between, you have markets with more limited numbers of buyers, where there may be some choice, but where standards can then come to play a part. And the warning on all these standards is some of them will pay a premium for something much better, but quite often in these markets, the higher standard becomes the norm, and there's only a discount for not meeting it.
Yes, and that's something we've sort of talked about from our, the import, the carbon border adjustment model. Is there a there is that risk that the minimum standard raises within the UK, and these expectations become the standard, and therefore the premium perhaps does disappear. Hopefully you've benefited from that transition, perhaps, but if it doesn't apply to stuff that's coming in, then you're always going to be a sort of a cost pressure.
And that's going to be one of the real challenges with the proposed SPS UK-EU agreement over food production in the UK, is that the UK government is likely to stress animal welfare, but not be able to stop other produce coming in that isn't produced as we would want. And we've been there with pigs and sow stalls and so on, and could easily be there with poultry sheds and whatever else.
On the question of kind of cooperation, we already have examples of actually where kind of cooperative models operate on both sides in some ways. So, for example, we have the kind of landscape enterprise network lens approaches that we're seeing. We've obviously got one functioning in Scotland now, where suppliers can come together and get investment together. And then we see it on the buyer side as well, through things like buyers clubs, where actually when outcomes, particularly I think in terms of water, actually are kind of widespread outcomes. So for example, with water, there's those kind of catchment based outcomes where actually you can come together as a collection of buyers and invest together, and that's a kind of easier mechanism to buy through, but also a way to generate that level of investment that potentially a single buyer might not be prepared to generate on their own, given that many operators will be receiving benefit. So there is kind of opportunity, I think, for cooperation on both sides.
Yeah, one of the challenges in this, and we've seen south of the border with farmer clusters and so on, where a number of farmers come together, and discussion at the moment around landscape recovery, which is a large-scale scheme of the kind of scale that should yield big biodiversity benefits and that sort of outcome, is that it's the impact of opportunity and liability on individual farms will differ between people. And getting the level of mutuality between people that accepts that how are burdens to be carried when somebody defaults, or when one person is clearly seen to get a large part of the opportunity or carry a larger part of the load. And these are issues that require quite a lot of management in some of these cases. The straightforward farm buying co-op, where you just achieve scale and are able to, I'm talking with one couple of months ago, where they've essentially had the diesel price fixed right the way through to October from before the Gulf War. They were well entrenched because simply by virtue of being able to retain skilled management, let the skilled management do its job without being interfered with, which is often an issue, and then having scale. And you see this with grain pools as well, where they're well run, and they can blend, and they've got more opportunities than any individual has. And those can help achieve things on input and output values to general benefit.
So going back to the letters that we wrote, we found that it was clear that government needed to get a letter as well. It wasn't just an ask of the supply chain. It's not often that we ask government to get more involved in regulation, but what was it that we were calling for sort of greater government involvement on, and what were the sort of policy gaps that we sort of identified?
What are the policy gaps, to me, is a tricky question, because I feel like it's one giant gap. And this is an emerging area of practice, and there is a real lack of regulation in this space. And as we've kind of consistently said, we want to make sure that these things occur in a high integrity, fair and transparent manner. And because these are supply chain issues more widely, government then needs to be involved in these spaces. And also a lot of these outcomes and initiatives will directly contribute to things that government wants to achieve. And so then inevitably government does need to be involved. We can't have, or we don't want the private sector to regulate itself. Otherwise we might end up in a kind of race to the bottom situation. So I think that this is important. It's also, these are, by the nature of these agreements, these end up being public goods, kind of thinking about climate action and regulation of water resources. These are all things that have public benefits. Equally, having access to healthy, safe and affordable food is also in the public interest, and protecting farmers, therefore, is in the interest of the public. So therefore, government should be involved.
I think the simple point is you can't disentangle government from this area of policy. It is driving carbon budgets now in Scotland as well as in England. It is looking, as Laura said, on water quality or air quality. It's got a whole series of environmental objectives. Scotland has the Natural Environment Act now on the statute book. To some extent, having talked previously about regulatory markets, there are aspects of government regulation in all of this. It has biodiversity targets, and for government to, particularly when government is looking for private funding to fill the large gap between public aspiration and expectation of the rural world, with what government actually finds it's able to pay, then the government needs to have an interest in how that money comes forward, how it contributes towards the government's own objectives, and does so in a way that complements its own work. So government doesn't. I don't think government escapes this, because so much of it is driven by public policy. And as Laura was saying, then we begin to talk about public goods, which and the point about those in this context is that they're goods that the market doesn't recognise. So, the easy answer around, animal health is a very clearly productive matter of productivity. Animal welfare is more often something that is a matter of public taste, and only in some areas do you get a better price for having honoured it. Looking at a number of other areas, the benefits are too widespread for it to turn up in any one particular action over production. And so this is where, again, public interest, and here in enabling the channeling of private money to meet public good.
Yeah. So in the letter, we also ask for sort of clarity on sort of finance and lending. Can you talk a bit more about what that ask was?
A key question in all of this is farmers' access and landowners' access to credit, and secured borrowing using farmland has been a very powerful means for businesses to improve themselves, to invest, or on occasion to have to resolve difficulties within the family or the business. And it's been a good area generally for banks to lend in, of both prudent borrowers and prudent lenders. And if you find that the outcome of one of these agreements makes it difficult for a lender to see that this is good security, that it may blemish the security, it may complicate the ability of a lender to have that ultimate assurance that if everything collapsed, they've got a clean farm to sell, to repay the loan that they extended. And this happens terribly rarely, but it's the foundation on which all this works. If you've tainted that, you've tainted an entire market for the economics of farming. And when you want to buy the 50 acres next door, when you want to put up the new dairy unit, this is the point where you need that borrowing capacity. And if that has been tainted, then that is a sector frustrated.
Yes. So similarly on this, Jeremy, what are the concerns around sort of succession and that long-term liability, but also the inheritance tax treatment of some things? We've seen that there are got a sort of recent update on certain exemptions from inheritance tax for agricultural relief on designated sites, and a few others. We're kind of waiting to hear if that extends to things like the Nature 30 land in Scotland. Obviously, the sort of the handling of the inheritance tax changes for agriculture have not been smooth, nor have they ever felt logical. But it feels the sort of further dripping out of information on what could perhaps be exempt doesn't help answer the sort of long-term questions that we have on how this fits with sort of succession and inheritance and that long-term land change.
Yeah, I mean, there are two aspects, I suppose, thinking about succession. And the first one is just the practicality. Have we fettered the ability of the next generation to be able to run a good business? Okay. And that is frequently a thought in farmers' minds that leads them to step back when they might accept an awful lot else, is that sense of the freedom to farm for the next generation. Even if you might think the next generation might be greener minded than this one, is nonetheless still a significant issue. And so having a business to succeed to, the freedom to run it in whatever the circumstances are in 5, 10, 20, whenever years' time. Moving on to your question around inheritance tax, we did, of course, have a success 2 years ago now in extending agricultural property relief with a slight twist. so that where you take land out of agriculture under an agreement with a public authority for environmental land management, that can have a kind of APR on it. But the use of that so far, 16 months later, is almost completely untested as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And the valuation will depend entirely on the terms of the individual agreement, and it is only for an agreement with a public authority. So an agreement with an ordinary buyer of produce or with a supermarket or with a forestry company or whatever else it might be is not a qualifying. And if land were to move completely out of agriculture, and by no means does all land in this discussion mean leaving agriculture, but if it moves out of agriculture, then the APR equivalent would not apply in those circumstances. And these are all areas where we have yet to build the practical experience. Not that many people have died yet, part of that, but is actually then the arguing through the understanding of how all this works in this rapidly developing area.
Is this something you think government has sort of been knowingly ignoring, or has it just sort of not wanted to sort of engage on it? It's very happy to have left it to the private sector to sort of get along with setting its own standards and delivering it.
Yeah, I think we're talking about different arms of government and so forth. I mean, fairness to the Treasury, and this came through from the previous London government, the environmental extension of APR, that was seen as a very positive move, partly to give people confidence that they could go some way down the environmental route and not risk losing APR, not to tell them to go the whole way down and use this new relief, but to be aware there was a buffer beyond that could protect them should they get caught out. And the extent to which that's bringing confidence, I suspect, has just been massively overshadowed by the other changes to APR and BPR that took effect this April. And the whole thing is a larger soup at that point, and in many ways has led to, and our land occupation surveys show this, led to a climate of uncertainty about many of these things that has held people back from acting. So but these issues, I think, require are ones that would require new further thought from government, rather than the fact that it's either particularly ignoring it or going down other roads. It went down that track as far as it went. It then got itself snarled up in this tussle of its own creation, and now probably doesn't want to think about anything very much again for a while.
Yeah, and I've got another one for you as well. Why is it that tenancy issues that we felt within sort of the ask of government, that tenancy issues deserved that sort of special attention?
Sorry, are you thinking of inheritance tax at this point, or are you thinking about...
Well, just within the sort of wider, as we were writing the letter, we made it very clear that the sort of tenancy issue was something that needed, definitely needed its own sort of attention. It wasn't just tenancy within all the individual parts, it was tenancy in general.
Because it is a distinctive aspect to the agricultural sector in terms of how rights in land are divided between people. And the tenanted sector is, in principle, a very good way of separating out long-term management, distant horizons with a lower appetite for risk from people with a more commercial appetite, a shorter to medium-term horizon, working capital invested in the business rather than long-term capital in stewardship. A tenanted sector, when it works well, is a natural way of doing that. Scotland has about 20% of its land, maybe just over, in agricultural tenancies. And that is something that has been a more difficult area of debate in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK. You have some very, very secure tenancies, and you have some very, very short tenancies, and those have different approaches and angles between them all. But if you're wanting to maximise the access to private capital to come in and pay for some of these changes, then losing out on that sector where you have willing parties. And as I tried to stress earlier, much of this requires mutual involvement by landlord and tenant to see where an opportunity to grow the cake between them in all of this. Where you can get that, then could bring more land into play to the public benefit, to the benefit of the parties and the tenant's own business.
Laura, the letter also talks about that need for devolution to be factored into these agreements, but also into how government acts as well. Why is it so important that devolution is, or that Scottish specific policy is written into Scottish agreements?
Well, I think, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the policy areas that Insetting interacts with are devolved. We've got kind of, as Jeremy mentioned, the Natural Environment Act, a lot of the agricultural policy. These are all devolved policy areas, and so the agreements must be cognizant of this. The targets and practices that may be appropriate in one nation will not fit with outcomes desired in another. And there's kind of lots of different pieces at play here. So we need to think about what we actually want to achieve with these agreements. And then this needs to be appropriate for the policy context that these agreements are going to operate in. They need to be interoperable with agricultural funding. They need to be interoperable, as Jeremy said, with the kind of tenancy agreements with crofting in Scotland as well. That adds another layer. So we do need to be respecting of that. And equally, from a practical point of view, if, for example, you were contesting terms in a contract as a farmer, you don't then want to have to be going to seek legal advice in another kind of nation. You want to be able to operate within the systems and dispute resolution mechanisms that are operating within your nation, and with advisors that you're already familiar with as well.
I mean, there are different legal tools in places. England will have conservation covenants that we're just beginning to acquire experience of that aren't repeated elsewhere in the UK. The nature of what is covered by Scottish succession law is different from succession elsewhere. The difference in the law of licenses varies. And you do actually want to have your agreement judged by the jurisdiction in which you are, because otherwise it's only going to make the dispute resolution process more complex.
So looking ahead, where do we sort of see Insetting in the future? Do we think these agreements become... Do you think there's a risk that these agreements become the sort of the norm, and that they therefore stop paying because that's just what we should be doing, or do they become the norm and there's a long-term payment here?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the future in this area is unknowable, but I think the starting point in this is for farm businesses themselves to look to their own resilience, and ultimately these are business questions. The amount of money that's around in the public purse for this was really last reviewed in 2013 and has been handed down. Yes, there was within the UK the Bew Review, which helped Scotland a bit, but essentially it was all fixed now well over a decade ago, well over a decade's worth of significant inflation in the meantime. You're watching that money erode and buy less as we go on. The idea that there is significant practical sums of private money that can be tapped for all of this has not yet been proven to have realistic outcomes for the generality of farmers for the number of years that we've been trying to do it. Doesn't say some of it won't emerge for some people in some places and so forth. And so it's down to business decisions about being resilient. And then that comes back to those businesses taking a business approach to where they go, that where these deals are offered, there is sensible adult and mutual discussion around all of this. If we're right that the learning curve that we're at the bottom of will benefit both parties, the farmers and landowners looking at it one side, but also the supply chain looking at it from their end, then we may arrive at a better structure for agreements that shares a level of assent, where then there is advice better attuned to what those agreements might offer and how they're tailored to particular circumstances, rather than it all just being made up, as it might seem on the hoof at times, at this point, making it much harder for a coherent body of analysis to be used to help people. Then in places that will come forward, as I think you were faintly implying, then some of this just becomes standard in supply contracts, the way that it is with Arla or other people in some of these areas, but that can only be pushed so far. And we will watch this evolve. But the underlying part of this is, as I probably stressed a couple of times, is the need for businesses to take a business attitude to this. Just because it has a green label doesn't mean it's anything other than business in its commercial substance between parties.
Something for me to add here is that we've talked a lot today about areas where we feel that we need more clarity and that there's policy uncertainty. But I think where we can say that there is policy certainty is that we know that this is the route that government wants to go down in terms of regenerative agricultural practice, decarbonisation, meeting carbon budgets. Those signals have been made very clear. Of course, internationally, we can potentially say that yes, there's been some challenges there and kind of eroding of confidence, but nationally, those commitments do remain. And so I think that we can confidently expect that there will be continuing requirements to be decarbonising, to be collecting this sort of data, to be taking action here. What those actions look like in future, that's where we potentially lack the clarity. But we can be expecting, I think, as Jeremy says, from a business point of view, that these are decisions that we will need to continue to be making and continue to need to be considering. These agreements potentially could become increasingly common, and that's why we've written these letters, because we want to start these agreements off on the right foot. We want to be kind of enshrining good practice from the beginning. To your point, Eleanor, about compensation, if we start now with the acceptance that compensation is appropriate, then that's what we want to continue with. Whereas if we don't kind of formalize these things now and regulate these things now, we could end up in a situation where you get some compensation now for the transition, and then later down the line it is accepted as best practice. And as I think I mentioned earlier, it's one thing for government to say we want private finance. You've got to then do something about it. Just saying that you want private finance invested in something doesn't mean that private finance is going to appear. You need to create the environment where that private finance can operate. You need to think about what kind of private finance you want, from whom, to do what. These are all questions that need to be answered. So while I think we do have the overarching policy direction, we now need to get into this nitty-gritty.
So I think taking from sort of part one and then sort of taking the read from this part two as well, that the general message to farmers is there are opportunities here. If you know your business, if you know where your climate risk sits within your farm, where you need to start thinking about resilience, and you need to work out perhaps what the whole farm plan is telling you as to where your opportunities are for regenerative and sustainable practices to sort of be brought on. There is potentially revenue here to cover that transition without needing to perhaps find it yourself. But rather than waiting for the policy, perhaps we need to work out what it is that fits our business, our farms first, and then pick the opportunities as they come. And if you don't have that assessment already, it's very hard to quickly assess the opportunities that may be put to you. And it's far easier to sit in a sort of cautious, let's wait a bit longer and see, which potentially makes it harder to access the finance going forward. But there's a way to use this system to future-proof and in theory make better business choices. But there's a huge skills gap there, and there's a lot that government can and should be doing to improve the policy behind it, but also to improve the communication. And equally, the supply chain has got to try harder to explain what it wants to achieve and why it's a good thing for the farmers to get involved in, rather than present it as a sort of inevitable change. So we'll finish with a couple of rapid fire questions. I won't do them all. What's one thing that government needs to prioritise, Jeremy?
Many of these discussions do come back to trying to talk about, as indeed Alistair Carmichael would, about balancing the supply chain. And so stepping into that, and that's as much a UK government matter as a devolved matter, but it is continuing the work, which is partly about attitudes and behaviour, and it's partly about what government policy can do, about balancing the supply chain so that costs and expectations are carried more evenly.
Yeah. Laura, one thing that supply chains need to improve?
I think for me, it's about working in partnership with suppliers to balance expectations and requirements. It's not enforcing this. It's having a discussion, recognizing the expertise and experience that farmers hold, and that actually, for a lot of them, this is something that they want to be probably doing. And so having that conversation is a good thing. And as I think Jeremy said earlier, these are going to be evolving practices. These are going to be contracts that necessarily will need to evolve as things change. And so if you start from a partnership basis, this whole thing is going to be easier for everyone.
And Jeremy, one sort of red flag in a contract that we should be looking out for?
Oh, I think the simple point about the contracts to start with is make sure you understand them. And whether it's a grazing tenancy, whether it's one of these contracts, whatever it is, can you explain it to another member of your family? And if you can talk it through and explain it and stand the withering criticism of whoever you're talking to, then you can be more confident about doing it. And that is a slightly different version of the point that we talked about earlier on, which is about taking advice and the prompt to take advice. But don't enter into whatever it is, an investment plan or anything it is, without actually understanding what you're doing. It may sound like gold and it can easily be fool's gold. So go and try, after you've had it pitched to you, go and try and explain it to your spouse, to your mother, to your bright 13-year-old, to somebody else, and hear yourself talk it through and realize what you don't understand.
That is an excellent point for, as you say, every kind of contract or agreement. And so finally, Laura, one reason that hopefully there is at least one reason that we can remain optimistic.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the mere fact that we are seeing these agreements coming through means that there is an appetite in the supply chain to work with suppliers to decarbonise, and let's encourage this. I think that's a really great thing to be optimistic about.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for your time today and very thorough questions. So throughout both the episodes, we've been really clear that insetting can be a legitimate and valuable way to decarbonise supply chains. The question isn't whether it should happen, but rather how. And getting that right means transparency, fair payment, informed consent, clear ownership of data and the outcomes, and a genuine partnership between farmers, land managers, the supply chain and government. And as this area continues to develop, understanding the opportunities and risks will be critical to ensuring Scottish agriculture and agriculture throughout the UK benefits from the transition, rather than simply carrying its cost and feeling like another obligation placed upon us.